routine surgery takes an unexpected turn when a nurse's face twists in disbelief the moment a black doctor steps into the room. It's not the scalpel or the anesthesia that makes her uneasy. It's the surgeon herself. But when lives are on the line, personal bias won't stop what's about to unfold. What will happen when skill outshines skepticism? Let us know in the comments section below. The doors to the operating room swung open with the usual sterility of a hospital's rhythm, but the reaction they provoked was anything but routine. The moment Dr. Simone Fowler stepped in, a beat of silence swept over the room, an almost imperceptible shift, but she felt it. Nurse Rebecca Callahan, standing by the instrument tray, stiffened just enough for Simone to notice. It wasn't outright hostility, no, that would be too obvious. It was in the way Rebecca's blue eyes flickered with a momentary pause, a quick assessment, as if recalculating something she had assumed before Simone had even spoken a word. Dr. Aaron Michaels, already scrubbed in, glanced up from his pre-op notes. "Dr. Fowler?" he greeted, his voice neutral, professional, exactly as it should be. Simone nodded, pushing down the familiar feeling in her chest. "Dr. Michaels," she responded, her tone crisp as she moved toward the sink. The routine took over, rolling up sleeves, lathering hands, scrubbing methodically. The smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, grounding her. But she knew the nurse was still watching. It always started like this. The silent test, the unspoken challenge. Rebecca cleared her throat, shifting her weight as she turned toward Dr. Michaels. "Doctor, I thought we were waiting on the lead surgeon." Simone didn't miss the implication. Neither did Michaels. He glanced at Rebecca, then at Simone, his eyebrows rising just slightly, a moment of hesitation. Though whether it was at the remark or the fact that he had to address it, Simone couldn't tell. "She's standing right there, Rebecca," Michael said evenly, giving Simone a brief look before turning back to the charts. "Dr. Fowler is leading this surgery." Rebecca didn't correct herself. She didn't apologize. Instead, she turned to the tray of surgical tools, fingers tightening around the metal forceps, as if they were the only solid thing in the room. Simone let out a slow, quiet breath and turned to the anesthesiologist. "Are we prepped?" Dr. Ocampo nodded, adjusting the mask on his face. "Patient stable, ready when you are, doctor." She moved to the center of the room, the OR lights flooding the space with a harsh, almost surreal glow. The patient lay still beneath the drape, heart monitor beeping steadily, oblivious to the tension surrounding them. Rebecca finally spoke again, her voice clipped, efficient. "Scalpel." Simone extended her hand. The cool steel landed against her palm, and just like that, the weight of everything else disappeared. This was her domain. The first incision was clean, precise. The first sign of trouble wasn't in her technique, it was in the way Rebecca hesitated with the next instrument. A fraction of a second too slow. A hesitation just long enough for Simone to recognize it as deliberate. She didn't acknowledge it. She wasn't going to. Instead, she focused on the work, guiding each movement with the steadiness of someone who had done this countless times before. It was the kind of precision that didn't come from arrogance, but from years of practice, of study, of proving herself in ways others in the room had never had to. Simone felt the shift in the room before she saw it, the unspoken realization as the procedure unfolded seamlessly. The patient's vitals remained stable. Her hands moved with controlled certainty, and slowly, the hesitation in the air, Rebecca's doubt, the barely veiled skepticism, began to fade. She wouldn't call it acceptance, not yet. But respect? Respect was earned, and she had every intention of collecting. The air in the operating room carried a weight that had nothing to do with the complexity of the surgery. It was something else, something unspoken yet palpable. The rhythm of the procedure continued as it always did, the soft beeps of the heart monitor blending with the quiet precision of hands at work, but beneath the surface of this routine, something simmered. Simone knew it wasn't just in her head. She had learned to trust her instincts in places like this, in rooms where she was expected to prove herself before even picking up a scalpel. She kept her focus on the work in front of her, her hands steady as she maneuvered around the patient's delicate anatomy. A mistake here would be catastrophic, but she wasn't about to make one. "Suction," she ordered. Rebecca hesitated, just a half-second too long. Simone didn't look up. She didn't need to. The delay wasn't enough to disrupt the surgery, but it was noticeable. A calculated hesitation. A silent message. Dr. Michaels cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "Let's keep it moving, please." Rebecca passed the instrument without a word. Simone accepted it, her grip steady as she continued the delicate process of repairing the damage. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but she felt the shift, the unspoken realization that she wasn't going to be shaken. She never was. In her peripheral vision, she caught Dr. Michaels glancing at her. He wasn't a bad man. In fact, in the years she had known him, he had always been fair. But fair wasn't the same as understanding. Fair wasn't the same as seeing. Simone had worked with surgeons like him before, colleagues who weren't overtly racist, who never made direct comments, who considered themselves neutral, but neutrality had never saved anyone. She could feel the question in his glance, the unspoken, "Are you okay?" She ignored it. There was no time for that. She placed another suture, tying it off with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. It was muscle memory now. The years of late-night studying, the endless hours of residency, the grueling tests. None of it was new. And yet she still walked into rooms like this and had to prove that she belonged. Dr. Michaels spoke again, this time directing his words at Rebecca. "Nurse Callahan, please stay sharp." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Of course, doctor." Simone almost smirked. Almost. But she didn't have time for satisfaction. The patient's vitals remained steady. The hardest part was nearly done. She allowed herself a moment to breathe. "Dr. Fowler," Dr. Michaels said, his voice lower now, just for her. "Flawless work." There was no condescension in his tone, no surprise. Just recognition? She met his gaze briefly. "Thank you." Rebecca didn't say anything. The silence was louder than any words. The room was still humming with a quiet intensity when they finished the procedure, but there was something else now, a shift, a crack in the doubt that had been hanging over her like an unspoken challenge. Simone stepped back from the table, peeling off her gloves as she let out a quiet breath. She turned to the nurses. "Good work." It wasn't meant for Rebecca specifically, but she let the words hang there long enough to be felt. The doors to the OR swung open, and Simone stepped out without another glance back. She didn't need to look to know what had just happened. She had been here before. She would be here again. And the next time, she would still be the one holding the scalpel. Simone pulled off her surgical cap as she stepped into the hallway, exhaling slowly. The adrenaline of the operation still coursed through her, but it wasn't just the procedure that had her heart beating faster than usual. It was everything. The silent microaggressions, the doubt laced into Rebecca Callahan's every pause, every hesitated movement. It was the exhaustion of carrying weight no one else in that room seemed to recognize. She had barely taken 3 steps toward the attending lounge when a voice called after her. "Doctor." She turned. Dr. Michaels was standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression that hovered somewhere between concern and calculation. He hesitated, then took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I wanted to say, your work in there was excellent," he said. Simone nodded, waiting. There was always something after that. "I also wanted to check in." He hesitated again, as if searching for the right words. "There was some tension in the OR. I noticed it, and I just wanted to make sure you're all right." She studied him, waiting to see if he would acknowledge the real problem, if he would name it. He did. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to respond in a way that wouldn't make him uncomfortable. She had done this dance before. "I'm fine," she said, keeping her voice even. "We got the job done." He studied her for a second longer, then nodded, as if satisfied. "Good. That's what matters." He offered a small smile, the kind people give when they think they've done the right thing, but don't want to sit in the discomfort long enough to understand what that really means. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Simone standing in the hallway, jaw tight. That's what matters. Not the way she had to push through quiet resistance in the room. Not the way she had to be perfect, just to be seen as competent. Not the way Rebecca had questioned her presence before she had even touched a scalpel. No, none of that mattered. Simone swallowed down the frustration, rolling her shoulders back as she headed toward the lounge. She wasn't here to complain. She was here to do her job. The lounge was dimly lit, a quiet space meant for attending surgeons to grab a few moments of rest before their next case. Simone moved toward the sink, running cool water over her hands, before bracing herself against the counter. A few feet away, another doctor sat at the small table, flipping through a medical journal. Dr. Lillian Ward, an older black woman in her late 50s, had been at this hospital long before Simone arrived. "You look sharp in there," Dr. Ward said without looking up. "Smooth hands, clean cuts." Simone straightened, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "Thank you." Dr. Ward closed her journal and leaned back, studying Simone with an expression that felt like it saw straight through her. Simone already knew what was coming. "You gonna let her get away with that?" Simone stiffened, not responding. Dr. Ward let the silence sit for a moment, then shook her head. "You think I don't know that look? I've been you before." Simone exhaled, turning around. "I didn't want to make it a thing." "It is a thing." Dr. Ward tapped her fingers against the table. "You know how many times I had to fight just to get people to trust that I could do my damn job?" Simone stayed silent. Dr. Ward leaned forward. "You can be twice as good. You can be perfect. But you're still going to walk into rooms where people see you as a surprise." Simone clenched her jaw. "I don't want to be the person always bringing it up." Dr. Ward's eyes softened slightly. "You don't have to bring it up, Simone. But you do have to decide. What's the line? What are you going to let slide? And what are you going to make sure never happens again?" Simone stared at the floor, her mind racing. She wasn't new to this. She had been proving herself her whole life. But she had also learned to pick her battles. She just wasn't sure if she was picking the right ones. The door swung open, and before Simone could respond, a nurse stepped in. "Dr. Fowler, you're needed in post-op. The patient's family has some questions." Simone nodded, pushing the conversation aside as she followed the nurse out. In the waiting room, the patient's wife sat anxiously in one of the plastic chairs, hands clenched together. When she saw Simone, she stood immediately. "Dr. Fowler," she breathed, "how is he?" Simone offered a reassuring nod. "The surgery was a success. He's stable, and we'll keep monitoring him, but everything went as expected." Relief washed over the woman's face, her shoulders sagging. Thank you so much." Simone offered a small smile. "Of course." She turned to leave, but the woman spoke again. The woman hesitated, then let out a small, nervous laugh. "I just wanted to say, I didn't know you were the surgeon. When they told me the lead was Dr. Fowler, I pictured—" Simone already knew how that sentence was going to end. The woman faltered, seeming to realize what she was saying. "I mean, it's all right," Simone said smoothly. "It happens a lot." The woman gave a sheepish smile, her eyes full of something close to embarrassment. "I'm just so glad he was in your hands," she said softly. "You saved his life." Simone nodded once. "That's my job." She turned and walked away, her mind still circling Dr. Ward's words. What's the line? Well, she didn't know yet. But she was starting to think she needed to find out. Simone stood outside the hospital, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The day had been long, but she wasn't tired. If anything, she was wide awake, her mind buzzing with everything that had unfolded in the past few hours. The surgery, the tension, the way Rebecca had questioned her presence before she had even spoken. She could still hear Dr. Ward's voice in her head. You have to decide what's the line. What are you going to let slide, and what are you going to make sure never happens again? Simone had spent her entire career navigating moments like today. The skepticism, the quiet pauses, the double takes, the need to prove herself over and over in ways that her colleagues never had to. And for the most part, she had kept her head down and focused on her work. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was the hesitation in Rebecca's hands. Maybe it was the way Dr. Michaels had acknowledged the tension but refused to name it. Or maybe it was the patient's wife, who had all but admitted she never imagined a black woman being the one to save her husband's life. Simone exhaled, running a hand through her hair. She could hear her father's voice in the back of her mind, steady and unwavering like it had always been. Simone, you don't get the luxury of ignoring it. You don't get to pretend it's not there. She turned back toward the hospital. She knew what she had to do. The surgical floor was quieter now, the chaos of the day settling into a steady hum of night shift routines. Simone walked with purpose, her heart pounding, though not with nerves. She found Rebecca near the supply station stocking a cart with fresh instruments. The nurse glanced up, surprise flashing across her face before her expression smoothed over. "Dr. Fowler," Rebecca said, her tone polite but guarded. Simone didn't waste time. "We need to talk." Rebecca hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an excuse to leave. Finding none, she sighed and straightened. "All right." Simone folded her arms, keeping her voice even. "Today, in the OR, you questioned whether I was the lead surgeon." Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it. Simone continued, "I need to know why." Rebecca's shoulders tensed. "It wasn't." She stopped, exhaling sharply. "I didn't mean anything by it." Simone tilted her head. "Didn't you?" A flicker of something crossed Rebecca's face. Guilt, maybe, or realization. She looked away for a moment, then back at Simone. "I've worked here for a long time," she said. "I've seen a lot of surgeons come and go, and when I heard we had a new lead, I just assumed." She trailed off, shaking her head. Simone nodded slowly. "You assumed he wouldn't look like me." Rebecca swallowed. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." "But you were." Silence stretched between them. Rebecca's gaze dropped, and for the first time she looked uncomfortable in a way that wasn't defensive. "I hesitated," she admitted, "in the OR. And that's on me. It won't happen again." Simone studied her for a long moment. This was not an apology wrapped in excuses. This was not deflection. This was ownership. She let out a slow breath. "Good," she said, "because in that room, in that moment, we don't have time for hesitation. We don't have time for assumptions." Rebecca nodded, looking at her properly now. "Understood." Another pause. Then Rebecca spoke again, softer this time. "You're good," she admitted. "I mean really good." Simone allowed the smallest smile to touch her lips. "I know." Rebecca let out a breath, half a laugh, half something else. She reached for the next set of supplies, but something in her posture had shifted. Simone didn't need her to say more. She had drawn the line, and Rebecca had seen it. The next morning, Simone walked into the hospital with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. She had spent years perfecting her skill, proving her worth, standing firm in spaces that weren't built with her in mind. And she would continue to, because she belonged. And after yesterday, there would be no more questions about it. Simone didn't move. The tension in the operating room felt like it had formed a wall right in front of her, one built by Nurse Callahan's silent but unmistakable resistance. The way the nurse's blue eyes bore into her was a clear message, one that Simone had read too many times before. She had walked into this room expecting to lead a life-saving surgery. Instead, she had walked into a confrontation. The heart monitor beeped steadily in the background. The bright overhead surgical lights cast stark shadows across Rebecca Callahan's face, highlighting the rigid set of her jaw. The room was so silent, it felt like everyone was waiting for someone to say something, for someone to acknowledge the thing simmering between them. Simone wasn't going to be the first. Instead, she moved forward, her step measured, controlled. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just walked like she belonged there. Because she did. Dr. Aaron Michaels, standing by the patient's side, finally broke the silence. "Dr. Fowler," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "everything set, we're ready to begin." Simone nodded once, her hands already moving toward the scrub nurse to receive her gloves. "Good," she said, her voice just as steady as her movements. "Let's save this man's life." Rebecca hesitated just for a fraction of a second before stepping aside and making room. That was the first victory. The surgery began. The patient on the table, a 52-year-old man who had collapsed from a ruptured aneurysm, was unconscious, oblivious to the unspoken battle that had played out before the first incision was even made. His body was still, his chest rising and falling with the rhythmic hum of the ventilator. But for Simone, this was where everything made sense. She drowned out the tension, focusing only on the work. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. The scalpel glided through tissue with practiced ease. She navigated around arteries, every stitch intentional, every motion deliberate. The hesitations, the doubts, the resistance, none of it mattered here. Her skill spoke for itself. And the further they got into the procedure, the more the tension shifted. Rebecca, still stiff at the beginning, started moving more efficiently. She stopped hesitating with the instruments. The pauses that had been deliberate at first became imperceptible. By the halfway point, she was handing Simone tools with the same speed and accuracy she would for any other surgeon. Maybe it was muscle memory. Or maybe, just maybe, something else was settling in. Simone didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. She just worked. Minutes stretched into hours. The OR felt like a different world, one detached from whatever had been brewing when Simone first entered. And then the aneurysm is sealed. Her words were met with a brief pause. Dr. Michaels exhaled. "Excellent work, Dr. Fowler." Simone allowed herself the smallest breath of relief. She made the final sutures, checked for any bleeding, then looked up. "Let's close." Rebecca didn't hesitate. The procedure was completed with precision, each movement in perfect sync. By the time they stepped away from the table, the energy in the room had changed. Not entirely, but enough. When Simone peeled off her gloves and stepped back, she caught Rebecca watching her. Not with anger, not with resistance, with something else. Something like understanding. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. And when Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was different. "Scalpel," she said, handing it off to be sterilized. Then, quieter, almost like an afterthought. "Good work, doctor." Simone met her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then she nodded, and walked out of the room. The hospital corridors were quieter now, the surgery behind her. Simone wasn't sure how she felt. It wasn't relief, not exactly. She was used to this, used to proving herself in rooms that should have already known what she was capable of. But something about today felt different. She leaned against the counter in the lounge, staring at her reflection in the stainless steel cabinets. She had drawn the line, and Rebecca had seen it. She heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Dr. Michaels standing in the doorway. "I wanted to talk to you," he said. Simone folded her arms, waiting. That was tense. He let out a small, exasperated breath. "I noticed it, even before the surgery started." Simone gave him a look. "Did you?" He hesitated. Okay. Maybe I should have stepped in sooner. I should have addressed it. She didn't say anything. He ran a hand through his hair. Rebecca's a great nurse, but she's been here a long time, and... He hesitated, then sighed. Sometimes people don't realize when they're holding on to old ways of thinking. Simone tilted her head. And you? Michaels blinked. You've been here a long time too, she said, watching him carefully. Did it ever occur to you that I might be walking into rooms like this every day? Michaels didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yeah, I guess it should have. Another pause. I'll talk to her, he said eventually, and I'll be more aware next time. Simone studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. He turned to leave but stopped at the door. For what it's worth, he said, you were the best person for that surgery today, and you'll be the best person for a lot more of them. She let out a small, dry chuckle. I know. He smiled slightly, then left. Simone exhaled, turning back to the counter. She didn't need validation, she never had. But today something shifted. Tomorrow she would step into another operating room, another challenge, another test. And the next time, there would be no hesitation, no questions, no doubt, just a doctor doing her job.